Known mostly for his famous writings, many people know Anselm of Canterbury for either the ontological argument or the satisfaction theory. But Anselm is much more than an argument or a theory. In learning about his life, it is my hope you can get a better understanding of his arguments and theories, but also that you are exposed to his devotion to God and how he overcame many adversities to help spread the gospel and build up the church. Anselm of Canterbury, also known as Anselm of Bec, was born either 1033 or 1034 in Aosta. His mother was a devoutly religious woman who showed patience and love to young Anselm in a way that modeled Christianity. But his father, on the other hand, was characterized by his harsh temper and created a toxic childhood for Anselm. Despite his father, he was a gifted child and picked up his learnings well and was at the top of his class from a young age. There is a story from the youth of Anselm that I believe helps introduce a guiding theme in his life. The story goes that his mother used to speak of God as sitting on high. Aosta sat at the foothills of the Alps, so in Anselm's mind he thought that God was at the top of those Alps. One night, Anselm enters into a dream, although he admits it could have been a vision. In the dream, he begins hiking up to the mountain to see God. On his way, he becomes frustrated as he sees people laboring in the presence of God, but instead of working hard, they were lazy, irresponsible, and dishonest. He decides that when he makes it to the top, he's going to tell God about all that is happening. But once he makes it to the place God lives, he is amazed. Once ushered into God's presence, he's so overwhelmed by his glory that he forgets his concerns of others and sits at the feet of God, who answers all of his questions. After this, God's servant brings him bread and he is flooded with overwhelming feelings and awakens from his dream. Not long after this dream, when he was about 12, Anselm's mother passed away. Under the sole parenting of his father, his household became a very toxic place. He speaks about the lengths that he would go to have his father show some kind of compassion, but he would never receive this from him. Nevertheless, sparked with a keen intellect and a strong belief in God, he found a monastery that he wanted to dedicate his life to. But his father refused to consent, and thus the abbey refused to let him in. After this, Anselm grew aggressively ill, to the point of death, but thankfully recovered not too long later. But after living in a stressful home situation and being denied entering a monastery, he set off on a passion of crossing the Alps, which turned into wandering around the Holy Roman Empire. This wandering around would last around 5 years, traveling from place to place, working small jobs and trying not to be captured by a feudal lord and turned into one of his servants. But after all this time, he started making his way to the Abbey of Bec in Normandy. About 10 years before this, the monastery hired a man by the name of Lanfranc. Lanfranc was, at this time, a foremost Christian theologian renowned for his Christian teaching. This was to create Bec as a center for Christian learning. Anselm showed up to Bec at the age of 20. His appearance was of someone who had been living a migrant lifestyle, and he came into contact with Lanfranc himself. Lanfranc, looking past the outer perspective of Anselm, would find within him a very intellectual spark. Why a monastery, though? It is essential to know that monasteries at this point were where people went to dedicate their lives to a deeper understanding and calling from God. He spent time learning from Lanfranc and traveling to some of the other local areas before, in 1060, after the death of his father, he finally took his monastic vows. Over the next 3 years, he would be immersed within the Benedictine monastery, learning about the rule of Saint Benedict and dedicating his days to studying and learning from Lanfranc. But 3 years after entering into Bec, Lanfranc was called by William the Conqueror to be the first abbot of the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Normandy. This left a void in leadership, but even at his young age, and with only a few years of experience, the leaders recognized his skills and abilities and named him to be the prior of the monastery. Anselm would have to prove himself for many years, but it was during this time that he made many connections and fell into a more profound love for the monastery and what it can offer to people. In 1070, Lanfranc was named Archbishop of Canterbury by William the Conqueror. Anselm would visit Lanfranc many times, becoming close not only with Lanfranc, but many of the leaders around him. In 1078, after the death of its warrior monk founder, Anselm was consecrated abbot of Bec. Although Lanfranc did an excellent job of bringing an intellectual focus to Bec, it would be when Anselm began to lead that Bec would become the true center of monastic learning. Two of the writings that encompass some of the teachings of Anselm are the Monologium and the Prosologium. Here we will take a short break away from the life of Anselm to talk about the Prosologium, as this work has been hugely influential both in philosophical and theological study since its creation. First, I do want to mention the Monologium shortly. Monologium, the Latin word for monologue, was one of the first significant writings from Anselm, written in 1075. Monologium addresses different ways of thinking and understanding God. Anselm was following a traditional way of defending God, and although there are some solid arguments and should not be seen as weak, it would be in the Proslogium that Anselm would make a name for himself. The Proslogium, Latin for discourse, was written in 1077 and 78. This writing has been incredibly impactful throughout history because of the premise that Anselm argues in this book, but I find it necessary to take a moment to properly frame the purpose of this book, as it has often either been thrown away or at least misunderstood. After writing the Monologium, Anselm felt that opposed to having a list of reasons as to God's existence, there must be one specific way of reasoning that would offer with great proof the necessity of God. After trying for years to find such an example, he finally gave up and thought that no such reasoning existed. But it was precisely here that in giving up his studies, he was sparked with an idea. But instead of holding it as a prideful proclamation against those who do not believe, or seeking to tear down the argument of those opposed to God, as some philosophers have taken this argument to do in the following year, I find it extremely important to look at a specific quote from the preface of Proslogium to understand why this book was written. Thinking, therefore that which I had rejoiced to have found would, if put into writing, be welcome to some readers of this very matter and some others. I have written the following in the treatise of one who strives to lift his mind in contemplation to God and seeks to understand what he believes. Anselm believes that by offering this understanding, he can lead others, like he has been led himself, to better understand God and what it means to believe in him. But let us now look at what the book actually talks about. Given the term ontological argument, much later by Immanuel Kant, Anselm frames chapters 2 through 4 with one very specific phrase defining God. God is that being that whom no greater can be conceived. What he means by no greater can be conceived is working off the premise that existence is always better than non-existence. So comparing something conceived in mind to something in existence, and whatever idea that means, the version that exists is better than the version that is conceived. If you were to ask which is better, a cheeseburger you have in your hand, or a cheeseburger in your mind that has all the best toppings cooked exactly how you liked it, the better one would be the one that actually exists in your hand. But Anselm would say that if that cheeseburger that did have all the best toppings and was cooked perfect existed, it would then be better than the other cheeseburger. Hopefully, this very simplistic description shows the premise that unless something exists, it cannot be the best thing. So if you were to imagine a God that is the best thing, it is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, just, compassionate, etc. The only thing that can make it better is if it existed. To the people who would argue that God is solely an imaginary being, but doesn't exist, Anselm would say that the image you have of God is not actually the ultimate being. He argues that the ultimate being would have to exist since that would be the only way it could be the ultimate thing. Thus, his phrase, God is the being that whom no greater can be conceived. I admit this is a simplistic representation of the argument, and I encourage you to visit some of the links in the description below to learn more. If you do have some questions, I will try to answer them to the best of my ability in the comments below. This is not the entire book though. The majority of the book is spent explaining in context of this necessary God, the attributes of God, and explaining what this being looks like. I will say this is not the only way of viewing God, although it has been helpful for many throughout history. It is important to remember why Anselm wrote this book, not an ultimate debate, merely explaining a way of viewing God. But that is enough talk about the Proslogium and the ontological argument. This video is not intended to be a defense of the argument. Hopefully, this can give a representation of the scholastic nature of Anselm and the types of learning that he helped bring to the monastery at Bec. Going back to the life of Anselm, he spent the next 9 years establishing himself in the monastery and occasionally visiting his mentor, Lanfranc, in Canterbury. Things began to change when, in 1097, after the death of William the Conqueror, his son, William II, also named William Rufus, which is Latin for red, took the position as king and began to create a chasm between the churches and his leadership. All of this came to head when, in 1089, 2 years after Rufus took office, Lanfranc passed away. Because of Anselm's impact in Bec and his relationship with those in Canterbury, he was expected to be appointed the next archbishop. But to everyone's surprise, Rufus refused to appoint anyone, going so far as to pledge that nobody would sit at Canterbury while he lived. Rufus also began taking land and money away from Canterbury and some of the other churches under his control. All of this changed, however, when Rufus fell gravely ill. For whatever reason, he was convinced that this illness was because of his sinful behavior. Probably because of the Christian leaders that were still left at Canterbury, Rufus reached out to Anselm to come hear his confession and administer last rites. After Anselm was summoned and did what Rufus wanted him to do, Rufus's health began to be restored, and not too long afterward, he was back to normal. Because of this, on March 6, 1093, he nominated Anselm to fill the vacancy at Canterbury. It is debated what the actual response of Anselm was to this. The records show that Anselm was very hesitant in this, as he would rather stay with his people at Bec. But whether this was genuine, or just an attempt to seem humble in this task, it would take until August 24th for the leaders at Bec and Anselm to come to an agreement on leaving his position. But when Anselm came back to the king, he had some conditions. Mainly, they were that he wanted to implement the Gregorian reform, but also Rufus would return the lands he took, he would accept his spiritual counsel, and he would forswear anti-Pope Clement III in favor of Urban II. The king initially refused all of these, but after some pressure, he agreed to partial return of Canterbury's land. However, he still refused to pick a side in the investiture controversy, which saw kings and bishops of the church fighting over the idea of who has the right of ecclesiastical appointments. Anselm and Rufus worked together on many things throughout their times as leaders, but the relationship was not nearly the same as their predecessors. They fought about many things, as Anselm envisioned a universal church governed separate the state, while Rufus still saw his right as ruling both church and state. One of the biggest things that Rufus refused was Anselm's efforts to convene his own councils. But one of the first significant schisms between the two happened around 1097, after two unsuccessful forays against neighboring successor states. Rufus attempted to fine Anselm, as he stated that he did not provide enough knights for his conquest to be successful. Anselm, of course, rejected this, and Rufus told him he had two options. They were leave now, and he would seize Canterbury and never receive Anselm again, or stay, and he would impose his fine and force him to never appeal to the papacy again. This led to Anselm departing in 1097, which was marked as his first exile, with Rufus seizing the revenues of which he would keep until his death. While in exile, Anselm completed the second of his most famous works, titled Cur Deus Homo, transliterated as Why God Was Man. Anselm built off of many scholars before him that explained the necessity of God as both man and divine. You can check out one of these scholars in the video about Athanasius in the description or the tab at the top of the video to see why he believed Christians must embrace both the divine and the humanity of Jesus. But most notably, he built off the Chalcedonian proclamation of truly God and truly man. Anselm's explanation of why this Chalcedonian proclamation is essential is based on the claim that only God could pay the debt that humanity owes. But how does this equate to Christ going to the cross for humanity? Anselm's framework is in the idea that humanity owes an infinite debt to God. It's helpful to think about it this way. If you were to spit in the face of a friend, it would be little consequence. But what about if you were to spit in the face of someone like the president? This would likely be met with some jail time and a severe fine. Now what if you were to spit in the face of God? Anselm argues that with our sin, we do this exact thing. Because God is of infinite worth, we can never repay our debt, and thus our lives are indebted to Him. So why does God have to be man? Because God is the only one that can repay such a debt. But humanity is the only one who owes the debt. If Christ was only God, He would have no need to actually repay the debt with a sacrifice. And if Christ was only man, His death would not be enough to repay the debt. This way of viewing the atonement was called the commercial theory, although later changed to the satisfaction theory, where the illustration takes on a courtroom terminology where the debt is framed as justice. But 3 years after he walked away on August 2nd, 1100, Rufus was suspiciously killed in a hunting accident, and 3 days later, Henry I rushed to take the place as the new King of England. Being the fourth son of William the Conqueror, he had little to his name, and, upon taking the throne, made an effort to repair many of the broken relationships under his brother's previous reign. For Anselm, this meant that Henry reached out offering Anselm his previous spot, the only condition being that he do homage for his Canterbury estate. But he refused this, stating that it violated canon law. Like with Rufus though, Anselm still kept a working relationship even when their ideas clashed. This resulted in Anselm being able to convene a general church council at London in 1102, establishing the Gregorian reform within England. To put it simply, this council prohibited such things as marriage, concubinage, and drunkenness to all of those in holy order. Furthermore, it condemned such things as sodomy, simony, the British slave trade, and regulated clerical dress. Because of this relationship between Henry and Anselm, it is important to note that Henry was in support of Anselm's reforms. The relationship would bite Anselm in the back though, as in 1103, Pope Pascal II excommunicated the bishops who had accepted investment from Henry, and Anselm received a letter forbidding his return and withdrew to Lyon for his second exile. In 1105, Pascal again excommunicated more prelates and threatened Henry with the same. Henry was in a very vulnerable spot, and once Anselm threatened to side against Henry, they agreed to meet on July 22nd, 1105. In this meeting, they decided to a compromise that had Henry forsaking lay investiture and giving back the revenues of Canterbury if Pascal gave his permission for clerics to do homage for their land. Almost a year later, in March 1106, Pascal finally wrote to Anselm, approving this deal and released his ban on the prelates involved with Henry. But although Henry was free with Pascal, it was Anselm this time that refused to work with Henry. He went down to meet Anselm and beg and agreed to change the tax structure against the church, which in general strengthened the rights of the church against the king. Anselm returned to England shortly after this meeting. Once he returned to England, he worked to prepare his successor upon his death. Much of this revolved around trying to make sure Canterbury was the central church for England. On his deathbed, he announced himself content. Unfortunately, on April 21st, 1109, he passed away. The life and work of Anselm have played a significant part in history. From his start at Bec, which began a scholastic movement that would spread quickly over the country, to his writings in Proslogium, where his argument for the necessity of God would have scholars from all fields debating still today. But probably, most importantly for the church, his work in Credeos Homo, in which his argument for the satisfaction theory of atonement has impacted Christians all around the world. Anselm is a great example to follow. His love for God was shown in how he dealt with those around him. I genuinely believe that Anselm's love of God is what drew him into a majority of the things that he did in his life. From training young students to producing writings for both learned and unlearned, to the position he played as middleman under two kings. More than the job title, Anselm did whatever he could to build the church and the people around him. But ultimately, his life was lived with the realization he had when he was a kid, that although it is important to build up the workers of God, when in the presence of God, he is all that matters, and living a life devoted to him was Anselm's goal all along. But with that being said, thank you for watching another video here on Christian Biography. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think about the life and works of Anselm. If this is the first time you've been introduced to him, let me know what you think about him in the comments below. But most importantly, I hope to see you again with another informative and accessible introduction.